Hello and welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. It's a non-controversial episode as we're doing another Thoughts On. And there's actually a good chance that there is a decent number of my fans who actually like the person that I'm talking about. And I'm just going to say, this one is not necessarily going to be that positive of a Thoughts On. Very odd considering at one point I myself would have considered myself a fan of the person in question, but you'll have to see what I mean when we actually get into the main story. But before we get into that, let's get right into the news. The first news story is going to be something that I kind of regret not talking about, the Thai election that just happened. For those who don't know the Thai political scene, Thailand is a country in Asia that has had a very interesting development in regards to its history. The TLDR was that in 2014, the incumbent government of Thailand was overthrown in a military coup, and that military junta created a brand new constitution of Thailand, and they also have a monarchy. But the TLDR on that is in order to make sure that things didn't go too shady, like things didn't go too weird, what happened is that they basically just reformed the parliamentary system, but in a way that had the very prominent military have its own political party, the Palang Parchatara Party. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. In the translation, it's the People's State Power Party. It is basically the civilian face of the military junta. But recently, we've seen a lot of people rise up against this current military dictatorship, and we, in fact, saw the elections go really well for the parliament. The party in question, that was the one of the military dictatorship, didn't really do so hot. The party that ended up winning was the Move Forward Party, a left-wing political party run by a businessman by the name of Pita Limjaronrat. They got 152 seats, but the problem is you need 251 seats to have a majority. But that's where things get interesting, because if you basically take all the parties based on their pro or anti-military junta positions, the anti-military junta parties have a collective total of 308 seats. Meanwhile, the pro-junta parties, 186. So people say if the cards are played right, then they could actually put forward a very interesting result for the election. And while PETA has tried his best to push forward this anti-junta coalition, many of the other parties in that anti-junta coalition are too afraid of what PETA would do. So there's been a lot of civil pressure to make sure that they vote for him as the new prime minister. And what is interesting is that even the military has actually stated that they would be okay with the election results. We'll have to wait and see if that's true, but that is interesting to see. This party isn't socialist, it's social democratic, but it's basically like a left populist type party, and hopefully Thailand will be able to move forward in its history. Now, the next story is actually going to be about an election that I've talked about a long while ago, but we're still looking into how things are bad. Turns out that people are looking at the Nigerian election again and very much confirming things that we already knew. The biggest one being that the election was very clearly rigged in the election. And the biggest thing that they revealed, recently a bombshell just dropped about it, because the official Nigerian polling station has officially posted the results of all of the polling places, like what the polling places turned in to the government to tally up the votes for the election. And when they did so, they started noticing some errors. The BBC literally taking the numbers themselves and basically going, okay, let's count them. And they went through all of the they went through all the data sheets for every state, and then they compared it to what the government of Nigeria said. And what they found out was when they added up the results, the results were a heck of a lot different than what actually was reported to have happened. The first one they showed was it was the River State. And they showed, like, when they did the count, Obi was the clear winner in that state. But the official total says Tinubu won. And it showed that they gave Tinubu an extra 106,000 votes. Meanwhile, they took away 50,000 votes from Obi. But the two biggest discrepancies came from the Oyigbo local government area, where Tinubu did not get that many votes at all, and Obi had clearly outmatched Tinubu. But then, when the official results came in, Obi's results were cut in half, and Tinubu was, like, his percentage was 6 times larger than what he actually got. The next one is Obio Akpor, where the official results had Tinubu with 80,239 votes. But when the BBC counted the vote totals based on the tallies, they counted only 17,293 votes. Meanwhile, Obi, they were told Obi only got 3,829 votes. But the BBC counted that he actually got 74,033 votes. And then the BBC was starting to, like, actually ask some questions, and it's like, okay, so what the heck is going on? And then one of the first things they did was they tried to get in contact with the people who were announcing the official results. The biggest one being Dr. Dixon Ariga. And then they asked them, hey, would you be down for an interview to explain what the heck happened? But then the election official that was seated next to them said, no, Dixon Ariga is not allowed to talk to the press. Very much confirming the very obvious fact that the Nigerian election was rigged, which I remained very steadfast in saying. Everybody in the Western world acknowledged this fact. If the elections were held free and fair, Obi would have won, but if they were going to be rigged, Tinubu would win, and that very much showed exactly what happened. And it's weird because, like, this is not even, like, any sort of hidden. Like, this is incredibly blatant what has happened. This is just so incredibly blatant what they did. It's just jarring. Speaking of other foreign elections, let's talk a little bit about the Turkish election. Turns out, things were actually going good because Erdogan and that one opposition candidate that I mentioned previously of the CHP, they're moving on to a runoff. And unfortunately, a lot of people are saying that things ain't looking so good. Because, like, people are doing it like this. I guess they're going to be counting through this again. Basically, what happened was, Erdogan managed to get, like, he was very close to winning with 49.52%. And the opposition person, Kemal, got 44.88%. And then people are doing sort of basic math with the other two options. Ognan, as I mentioned before, is a very far-right guy, so many people say that his 5% will probably go to Erdogan. And Muharrem İnce, all the people who remained and cast their ballot for him will probably go to Kemal, which, I mean, I'm not going to spoil the details. That pretty much puts Erdogan as the winner. I am interested to see, like, perhaps, but maybe not, maybe Ognan voters go to Kemal because they're sick and tired of Erdogan. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Speaking of things we'll have to wait and see about, Ecuador did something very interesting. So, for those who don't know, Ecuador has been going through a little bit of a political crisis. A political crisis very similar to another Latin American country. And this ended up leading to basically the same results. What happened is, their current president, Guillermo Lasso, was facing an impeachment vote. And he has I think he's been impeached before, but it didn't work. But now with reinvigoration, people were pushing for an impeachment vote. So what happened was, Lasso made the case as to why he shouldn't be impeached. And then the day after he did that, he made an announcement to the nation and to the parliament, deciding that he was going to do a very interesting trick, announcing that he would do something called the Muerte Cruzada, meaning mutual death, where he would dissolve the National Assembly and basically resign from the presidency and hold snap elections. And what's even more stunning is Lasso announcing the day of, or the day after, that he would not even run for this upcoming election. That this election would literally be him resigning, essentially. When's the snap election going to be? This year. Like, this year is when the snap election is going to be held, taking place within the next 90 days. It is currently scheduled for August 20th, because that's, I guess, where 90 days are up. But it could be held earlier, or it could be held later. It really depends. And of course, a couple months later, it'll go to a runoff if nobody gets the, percentage they need. 50% or 10% higher than the opposition. And if you've been paying attention to how Ecuadorian politics has been up to this point, you know that things are going to get a little bit interesting. So, for those who don't know anything about Ecuadorian politics, let me explain this briefly. And by briefly, I of course mean for a while. So, for a while, Ecuador was led by a man by the name of Rafael Correa. Rafael Correa was one of the pink tie leaders, one of the forefront advocates of socialism of the 21st century, very much in line with Lula, Morales, Chavez. In fact, in my pink tide video, he's literally the other guy in the thing holding arms. To an extent, he's considered the fourth musketeer of the pink tide. Maybe I'll make that the poll of this episode instead. Who's the fourth musketeer of the pink tide? Him, Daniel Ortega, Nestor Kirchner, or someone else? I don't know. I did that poll once on Twitter, and Ortega won, even though I honestly don't understand why. I would have thought that him or Nestor would have had a better chance, but I don't even necessarily think that that's going to be the poll. That's irrelevant. But anyways, he was the one in charge, and he was very interesting, even amongst other pink tide leaders, because his version of socialism was a bit more socially conservative than other countries, but it wasn't really that notable. It was basically just something interesting that set them apart. But what happened next was, of course, as I'm going to say again, interesting. Due to Ecuadorian law, Correa could not run for a fourth term. So instead, he decided to give the torch to his vice president, Lenin Moreno, who ran and won. But the problem was, Lenin Moreno was not the same person as Rafael Correa, and had basically shifted his politics to be a bit more market-oriented. And that led to the basically collapse of the Ecuadorian left. So what happened was, due to this, many people who were loyal to Correa basically said, you know what, fuck you, and decided to leave and join their own political party to basically reinvigorate Correaism. But Moreno remained firm in his stance, saying that it was best for the people to remain in his party. But there was also another faction of the left that sort of sprouted. They were the extremely indigenous activists within Ecuador, who felt that the Correaism, even that, was a failure, due to the fact that Correa very much heavily relied on oil and basically nationalizing things that would ruin the environment, and that harmed indigenous people a lot. And a man by the name of Yaku Perez basically decided that he was going to mount a challenge to a degree, the left of Correa, but not necessarily. Then there was, of course, the País Alliance, which was the party that Correa and this other person didn't like. And what ended up happening was, Correa's former party, the País Alliance, got 9th in 16 candidates. Now, that sounds bad in and of itself, but think about it. 9th out of 16, 8 plus 8 is 16. So that means she was in the lower half of the candidates. Very bad. Yaku Perez got a pretty close third, to the point where many people were even speculating that it could have been Correa's party versus Yaku. And there was a bit of a divide because Yaku was not even necessarily of the left wing of his own party. He was in fact of the right wing, And in the last election, Yaku had publicly supported Lasso for the presidency over Lenin Moreno. And while he didn't publicly support anybody in the second round of this cycle, there was still lingering expectations that he was leaning towards the right-wing candidate. And as such, Yaku, basically, the Gray Zone basically published this big expose claiming that Yaku was like this Fed, essentially. But it's like, they also said that of Gabriel Boric, so I don't necessarily know how accurate that is. But basically, Yaku has some susness to him, but it's like, there is some elements of, I kind of get where he's coming from. And with that, many people thought that the Ecuadorian left was failing. And in fact, it seemed very odd. It seemed very odd considering the fact that all these other Latin American countries were getting like resurgences of the pink tide, and then there was Ecuador that didn't really do anything of the sorts. But in the recent elections that happened, like the recent local elections, it turned out that things were going good. Like Correa's party actually managed to, like the new party, not the old party, the new party, it turned out really well and it did really good in the elections. So many people are saying the left wing in this race will probably be a lot more interesting. The real question is what happens next, because they didn't necessarily know who will be the candidate that's the torchbearer. If I had to take a guess, it would probably be either Correa himself, because I think he tried to run in the last election, but he probably won't. He's kind of been floated around as a potential contender, but we don't know. But the biggest one that I'm thinking is Carlos Rabascal, who was the VP candidate of Correa's party in the last cycle. But also, Yaku has announced that he also intends to run for president. He originally announced that he was going to run in the 2025 election cycle, but it looks like this one might be an open field for him. Oh, by the way, I should mention, the 2025 election for Ecuador will still happen, so this election is literally going to be just for 2 years. But anyways, again, we'll have to wait and see how the Ecuadorian election pans out. Speaking of things we have to wait to see to pan out, things aren't panning out so well for Noam Chomsky, because it turns out his Epstein connections were a little bit more interesting than we thought. Because it turns out Jeffrey Epstein had moved $270,000 for Noam Chomsky. Now again, this technically isn't wrong. It's technically not wrong, because technically these are the fully legal and fully right things that he can do with Epstein, but it's not looking very good for Chomsky. Like I said, if Chomsky is found out tomorrow to have been on the Lolita Express, it wouldn't be surprising at this point. So yeah, anyways, now let's move on to the last story, the biggest bombshell. So, for those who don't know, and I think it's very unlikely that you don't know at this point, Dianne Feinstein. Oh boy. The Dianne Feinstein story is getting way more interesting because it turns out that all the Democrat people who are clamoring for Feinstein to resign and leave, they have no one to blame except Nancy Pelosi, because apparently a bombshell was just dropped where it revealed that Nancy Pelosi's daughter is the primary caregiver of Dianne Feinstein. Originally, not that big of a deal. But in the article where this was released, they've stated that the reason why that they are not pressuring Feinstein to retire or resign is purely for political reasons, not for anything regarding Feinstein or anything regarding the state of California. It is purely for political reasons and their own interests. Because basically, what has happened is, everybody has stated, like as the article states, and I got into debates with people about this, but it's like, basically, as the article states, many people are saying that if Dianne Feinstein retires, then what would happen is that Gavin Newsom, as his own promise stated, would appoint a black woman to fill in the seat that Feinstein currently holds. And who is the biggest, well-known, woman of color in California at the moment, Barbara Lee, and they stated point blank that there is an enormous probability that he would appoint Barbara Lee to fill in for Feinstein if Feinstein were to retire or die, which would make it harder for Adam Schiff to continue his campaign due to the fact that that would give Barbara Lee the advantage of incumbency. Now, there were some people who were saying, like, but they wouldn't appoint Barbara Lee. Well, that's what the article literally says. The article says that is literally the worry. The worry is that he would appoint Barbara Lee. That is the worry. And there are a lot of people who keep saying, like, no, he wouldn't appoint Barbara Lee. It's like, but they state point blank, this is their concern. They are concerned that Barbara Lee would be appointed. I didn't bring up Barbara Lee being appointed. They're the ones who brought it up. So clearly, that is something that was in the realm of happening. And I brought it up like this. It was basically no different than when he appointed Alex Padilla to run for the seat. Like, he appointed Alex Padilla, and then Alex Padilla ran for the election. Basically, I'm pretty sure that was the idea. Like, everybody around the circle, around Dianne Feinstein, was basically sitting there waiting what would happen next. It was the same thing that happened with Joe Biden. Everybody was sitting there waiting to see what would happen next. They weren't going to do anything until they knew for a fact that Dianne Feinstein was going to retire. And then Katie Porter basically just was like, I'm tired of waiting. And then, due to the fact that she was like, I'm tired of waiting, then Schiff said, I'm tired of waiting. Then Lee said, I'm tired of waiting. My guess was that everybody was waiting to see if she would retire. Like, if she was going to retire, or if she was going to full on resign. Because if she would resign, I'm pretty sure behind the scenes, everybody was lobbying to be the choice for an appointment. Everybody was waiting to be the appointment. And Barbara Lee didn't have to do much because Barbara Lee was very clearly in the realm of being the appointment. And I think that's the exact same reason why Barbara Lee is painting herself as, I am the transition senator. She's the one that will be the transition to whoever is next in line. That's why she's painting herself like that, because that was what she was going to do when she was going to, notice how after Feinstein, after Katie Porter, opened the floodgates, immediately everybody's just like, yeah, I'm running too. Like, everybody was behind the scenes saying that they were running too. They were all geared up and ready to go. The same thing would have happened with Joe Biden. If Joe Biden gave the signal that he wasn't going to run again, everybody would have announced that they would run. It was Porter's impatience that pushed everybody into high gear on what to do next. And now that candidates are already running, now people are seeing the worries of this. This should be very much investigated because of the huge conflict of interest. Pelosi literally stated that she supported either Feinstein or Schiff. And this is showing, she clearly has a bias in regards to keeping Schiff into contention. And again, there are people who did say, point blank, Lee would not be appointed. There was no way Lee would be appointed. It's guys, Lee would have been appointed. If Feinstein resigned, Barbara Lee would have 100% been appointed to be the senator. Newsom would not have appointed himself because of one simple fact. There is no black woman in the Senate. That is literally the only reason he would not appoint himself. If this was an open seat and he was currently not governor, he would run. But I'm pretty sure he was thinking that Feinstein was going to retire or that he would get ready to appoint someone else in that place. So he was going to appoint someone in the immediate for, Kamala's seat. Then he would save, the big special one, I'm going to keep a black woman in the Senate with Barbara Lee in Feinstein's seat. Feinstein was the candidate of the least resistance. Black woman, allied to Kamala, big progressive. She had all the bases packed. Her and Padilla were literally the only two candidates that really were the path of least resistance. Padilla, because he would literally run as whatever the heck people wanted him to be at the time. But anyways, I've been talking about that topic long enough, so let's move on to the main topic of this video. And again, it's a topic that pretty sure a lot of people will find very controversial. And there's a good chance that he's watching this and playing this on a stream, so I'm going to say this. Hey Dylan and his audience, how you doing? youtube.com/epluribusunumyt, and from there you can find all my other important links, like my Patreon, patreon.com/epluribusunumyt. Okay then, Dylan Burns. Dylan Burns is a political streamer who began getting some prominence in the lead up to the 2020 election, not initially due to his streaming. He initially got involved with political activism for the Mike Gravel candidacy, a very interesting start to his career. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's like, that's the presidential campaign you worked on. Not dissing the work that he probably did put into the campaign, which I'm pretty sure was definitely more warranted than it was needed for that specific candidacy. And he's also worked on other candidacies, Jill Carter, Michaela Wilkes. He worked for a guy who was his mayor, but he does not really associate with that candidate anymore for reasons. If you know, you know. If you don't know, you probably will know. Now, I guess we're going to have to start off with the most basic thing about my thoughts on his content. Very simply put, I was at one point a fan of Dylan Burns' content, even though Dylan Burns was sort of in the same vein of basically every other political streamer. Very unfortunate thing about every single political streamer is that they're all the same. Like, basically all of the political streamers of a certain variety are the same. Like, they all rip off Destiny. Dylan Burns, Xander Hall, Vosh, they're all essentially the same. There's very slim differences between them and Destiny. Sure, there's like slight differences here and there, but for the most part, they have the exact same style and format. Like, I'm pretty sure you could make a graph or like a picture, and I guarantee you a lot of people probably have, that show all of these streamers, and they all basically have the exact same style and format of how they make their content, how they word their arguments, and whatever. This isn't something that's uniquely a Dylan problem, like I said. Everybody is ripping off basically each other. The only difference is some people can take it and then go in a little bit of a different direction. Like, for example, we'll start off with Destiny. Destiny's the OG. He's basically just this lib creator that, like, plays video games and then debates people. Vosh comes in, does that, but from an explicitly left-wing bend. Then comes Xander Hall. Then comes Dylan Burns, who, I guess, technically comes at it from a... I'm trying to really figure it out. I don't know if he necessarily warranted himself as like a foreign policy expert before or after he started going to school for it. But that was sort of, I guess, the thing that set him apart, which is, I guess, something I have to give him credit for. Like, he was more well-versed in world affairs. Now, to the angle in which it is and how it is useful for lefty discourse is a bit of a different discussion. But the difference between them is basically Vosh could cite you fucking like Marx, Lenin, or whatever. Dylan could cite some like random foreign policy, whatever. And Xander Hall, put a pin in that for later. I should really stop making these jabs at Xander Hall. This isn't his episode. I already did one on him. But this is to give Dylan some form of credit. Like, where, I'm still a fan of Vosh, and I subbed to Xander Hall for a little bit, and then I realized there is literally nothing that sets him apart from Vosh. So what's the point? So I left. Then I joined the Dylan fandom, and there was a bit more to stick around to see, because there was differences between Dylan Burns and Vosh. But over the course of, the years, it seems that those differences started being less prominent, and not in a good way. Now, another thing that is interesting about their specific ilk of, politics is that technically they are supposedly very varied in their political perspectives, but then when you actually start looking at their political perspectives, you realize there really isn't that much difference in all due respect. Like Xander Hall, he claims to be an anarchist. I've never once seen anything in regarding to how he makes his content or how he explains his political views or anything of the sort that even remotely makes me think that he was an anarchist. To the point when I saw somebody say he claimed to be an anarchist, I was legitimately like, are they joking? But no, he literally claims to be an anarchist. Vosh is very well known for espousing stuff like market socialism and libertarian socialism. But Dylan, a bit more basic, Dylan, for lack of a better term, is a liberal. He doesn't really identify with the term. I don't know if he identifies with the term. I think he does. But in the old school American politics sense where it's like, oh yeah, everything left of conservatism is liberal. When the official BreadTube wiki gives him his tendencies, he's identified as a social democrat or a progressive. And, I mean, calling him a social democrat, that definitely seems to fit in regards to certain policies of his. Not in the best ways, but whatever. But I guess I should also say this, like, I was thinking going in while re-looking back at Dylan Burns' content and stuff, after not being a fan of his for a while, I thought I'd have, like, a much more negative view on him. And while I do have one, it's definitely not like, I thought that I would end this video by being like, oh, vitriolic anger of him. But, I mean, it's like, it's probably also because I genuinely have stopped caring about, like, this whole streamer, I'm sick and tired of, like, the freaking, like, drama and stuff and whatever, to which I see you typing in the comments, if you're sick and tired of drama, why are you making this video? The whole point of this series is not drama. It's not supposed to be. As the title suggests, it's my thoughts on a creator. But we're not going to get into more of his political views now. We're going to go back to his content, but I assure you, we will get back to his political views at some point. Put a pin in that for later. We'll instead be going back to his content, because his content was kind of when I started to, like, stop being a fan of his, because, you know, like, the fact of the matter is, as much as the debate streamers hate to admit it, a lot of the criticisms given towards debate streamers or, and as I keep saying, like, debate streamers, that obviously tells you he's a debate streamer, if you didn't know that already, they like to claim, like, that the video essayists, like, they're exaggerating all the problems they have with debate streamers, but it's like, in actuality, we very much see the problems with the debate sphere and streaming content, and as I've started to see the errors, I've started to see the problems have started becoming a lot more clear that I'm, like, as I get older, I guess. And the absolute fact is, Dylan Burns is 100% the reason why I am not really a fan of debate content anymore. And as the thumbnail shows, it very much has to revolve around the Hippy Dippy Roundtable. For those who don't remember what the Hippy Dippy Roundtable was, it was a show that Dylan Burns would host that was basically turning the debate sphere of politics Twitch and politics streamers and basically screwing any sort of, like, actual attempt to have an actual discussion on issues. Like it was basically a response to people that are like, this is, like, not even actually addressing actual problems. And Dylan Burns was just like, yeah, you know what, screw that. So let's just lean in hard on it. The format was like this. Dylan Burns would invite, like, 8 or so people to debate, and then they would discuss something, and he would basically just sit there and do nothing while they basically all yell at each other. And then over the course of the time period, he would then have his audience say who performed the worst in the debate. And then the person who performed the worst would be kicked out and then replaced with someone else. And then that would go on until something. I don't really know. There was something about, like, the whole bullshit about, like, oh, the hippy dippy extravaganza or whatever. But it's like, legitimately, this is just terrible. Now, as a younger person, again, I saw the spectacle and I was like, yay, yay, yay. And I say this, it's, like, stupid because it's like me and Dylan are, like, basically the same age. I think he's, like, a year older or younger than me. I don't know. Like, at first, everybody liked the spectacle, but then it's like, eventually, the format just got annoying. Especially considering one of the big things that he would do was that he would put a specific streamer in the thumbnail or the title. So what would end up happening, especially for me, was that I would show up, be like, hey, the streamer isn't in the video yet. So I just skip to the part where he enters, and then when they leave, I leave. Like, there was no point. Like, literally, I didn't care. I only came for that one specific person, and there's, like, just 7 other people that I literally don't care about. And there was no actual reason for the show to exist outside of just stupid spectacle, which is terrible. Like, legitimately, it's terrible. To which I'm sure a lot of people will say, it's just supposed to be entertainment, dude. But that's the problem. That's not what a debate is supposed to do. Especially considering, like, Vosh will make a video going like, you see, my debates with the far right are actually very influential into getting people to move away from the far right. Then you have Dylan over here literally just inviting like 5 far right people and like 1 trans person, and be like, debate whether or not trans people should be genocided. Go. I'm pretty sure that's not necessarily how a actual hippy-dippy roundtable would go, but for the most part, it really did seem like that. Dylan Burns would invite literally the most extreme, radical fucking idiots to come onto the show and debate completely, like, topics that should not be debatable just for the sake of, oh, it's entertainment. But the problem is, all he did was just platform these people to a very big audience to watch them derail. All of this while Dylan Burns would then hold debates on his own channel. Like, it would be him versus someone else. He would platform people like Hake, Jackson Hinkle, Kevin Castley, critically thinking veteran. I legitimately hated the fact that Dylan Burns kept inviting critically thinking the fact that he kept inviting these 4 people to his show was a terrible thing. And like the reason why Jackson Hinkle's in like the fucking like Subarus and like with going to red carpet premieres and going all these big right-wing podcasts, Dylan shares a ton of the blame for this. He's the one who brought Jackson Hinkle on his show to then go around and then do this big hissy fit, because that's the point of the debates. They realize this is the fact, and Dylan Burns, he claims to know this because that was the whole point of the hippy dippy roundtable. It was just the spectacle. Nobody was there to change their minds. Everybody was there to get their talking points to their audience, and then that would lead to their audience growing because they got a mutual benefit from appearing on each other's show. Now, Dylan might say, but I platformed some of these people to talk down to their views. It doesn't matter. You do realize that does not matter. If they're on your show, you've just introduced their ideas to your audience and the audiences of tons of other people who probably don't share your monolithic view on an issue. Even if you bring them on to talk crap about them, all you've done is introduce them to a large audience. And it's even worse when Dylan Burns tried to platform people who are just objectively bad people. Like, he tried to bring on Jean-Francois Gréby on his show, and then it's like, yeah, John Gréby literally, like, raped an autistic teenager. Why are you bringing him on this massive platform to spread his views and potentially get more victims to come to him? That's very weird. Granted, Dylan Burns inevitably didn't bring this person on, but the fact that he was going to and didn't really see the problems with it was very worrying. And I should mention one other thing about the Hippy Dippy Roundtable. Like, this is another thing that's interesting. This wouldn't even necessarily even work 100% of the time, because what would end up happening is that inevitably, what would happen is that 2 people would inevitably take over the panel, and they would just go in this huge hissy fit, and then 1 or 2 of the people on the panel would just never get to speak at all, and then the people who never got to speak would inevitably just get booted out anyways. It's like, great, they were invited on the Hippy Dippy Roundtable, and they didn't even get a chance to say anything. Now, I know that's a slight exaggeration, but you get what I'm saying. And granted, Dylan Burns did get it, because eventually he just decided, yeah, this is just a stupid idea, and pulled the plug. He's kept it on the wayside, like, maybe it'll come back, but hopefully it does not, because the Hippy Dippy Roundtable was literally the worst thing that could happen to any sort of like political debate. I don't trust political debates specifically because of that. That was the thing that was like, yeah, like this is just so blatant. You don't care about the actual truth of an issue. You care about getting your pwns and owns and leaving. That's what you care about. Now this part I didn't really have a segue for, but I'm just going to mention it anyways because I find this thing, because I had to rewatch a lot of Dylan Burns content to kind of get certain points that he was making, because there was one thing I was explicitly searching for that I never got to find because I don't think it exists, but we'll get to that in a second. But this is the thing that this is something that I saw that I was just like, after seeing this, because I didn't see this officially, I saw the actual debate itself, but I didn't see this video about it. But basically, it was Dylan Burns' debate recap of Vosh and Mike from PA. For those who don't really care about the streamer fiasco drama, Mike from PA is a socialist streamer, and Vosh is, of course, a socialist streamer. And they had a debate at one point because of a huge drama surrounding the Omaha mayoral race. And I guess we'll have to get into that in order to understand the full context. So basically, here's what happened. The streamer, known as Destiny, gave support to a candidate in the race by the name of Mark Gudgel. Mike from PA decided to throw his 2 cents in and gave his support to Kimara Snipes, which led to Vosh and, by extension, Dylan make the case that Mike from PA was only doing this to scorn Destiny. Mike from PA would respond to Vosh in the debate and say that the reason why he got involved was because Kara Eastman endorsed her as well. And I'll just say this for everybody who is curious. Can it be both? It legitimately can be both, and it probably is both. He probably entered the race he probably wanted to get involved in the race, but he didn't really have a reason to. And then Kara Eastman gave their support to Kimara Snipes, so he's like, I have my reason to now. Now, the debate itself rubbed me the wrong way to an extent, but it's also Dylan's response that rubbed me the wrong way. First of all, Dylan had no idea who Kara Eastman was and said that she was the Republican mayor of the area, and then everyone was like, you're stupid, and he's like, oh yeah, you're right, I am. But then, when Mike from PA actually explained who Kara Eastman was, it showed just how little Dylan and Vosh understood the area's politics, and by extension how little they seem to understand politics. Like when Mike from PA said the whole like funny meme of like, you don't know anything about politics, it's embarrassing that I'm talking to you, there was a slight hint of truth from it. Like there was something, I guess I'll just say this, like where he made this whole point like, you don't know what sewer socialism is? How, Mike from PA, that's so stupid. Who knows what sewer socialism is? It's like, I'm kind of shocked that you don't know what that term means. Like, legitimately, I was confused. Like, wait, how do you guys not know those terms? I don't get it. This is like the quintessential explanation of how socialist politics works in the United States. Like, sewer socialism was literally the most successful branch of socialism that I could think of, especially in America. Regardless, this showed how little they really seem to know about this race. So, for those who do not know who Kara Eastman is, let me explain. Kara Eastman is a 2-time progressive candidate in Nebraska's 2nd District, the one that gets its own electoral vote, beating the former Democratic congressman and his daughter in both primaries, and was in striking distance of flipping the seat until she got snubbed by her local party. She, of course, endorsed Kimara Snipes in the Omaha mayoral race. Both Vosh and Dylan seem to be really confused as to why she was mentioned. Like when he brought up her, they were like legitimately like, why are you bringing up Kara Eastman? Who cares? And then basically all of the responses were like, do you know who ran in this district or this district or this district? They endorsed blank, so you should do blank. To which I am sitting here going, she's from Omaha. What do you mean, why is she important to this race? She's from Omaha. Her district is Omaha. She was literally the candidate that was on the ballot for people in Omaha. And she's a prominent progressive figure in her state And, again, in Omaha, need I remind you, was the area that this whole drama was revolving around. And she was a very prominent nationwide candidate. Why do you guys not know who she is? I'm genuinely confused that you guys do not know who she is. I was more shocked when I saw the actual debate than when I saw Dylan Burns' recap of the debate, because by that point I have basically understood that streamers basically lower the attention spans of everybody watching them. But I do genuinely, like, why? Why are you... I literally am so confused about the fact that you're just openly admitting that you didn't know about this prominent political figure in this area to see how things were going. Oh, and I should mention, Kimar Snipes beat Mark Gudgel. She didn't make it to the runoff, but she got 4th, he got 5th. Dylan was, of course, backing Destiny's candidate and not the actual progressive candidate in the race, but, which again has to basically lead me to explain that Dylan is basically a liberal, and not in the best way. And if you even want to call him a social democrat, even then, it's like not in the best way, because one of the very noticeable things about Dylan Burns is the fact that he is very much not in the same vein of politics as leftists, but very much a lot more in line with liberals, but claiming that he is a leftist, because the fact of the matter is, calling yourself a liberal is a death sentence on the internet. And of course, one of the biggest and noticeable ways that this comes off is his foreign policy. Now, on a first glance, you would think, oh, foreign policy, good. Like, Dylan Burns, he said, like, he supported Evo Morales during the 2019 Bolivian coup. He worked for the Gravel campaign, who spent their entire campaign basically being like the extremely anti-interventionist candidates. He must be really, really good on foreign policy. Well, Dylan Burns made that very abundantly clear that he was definitely not in that vein of foreign policy. I think the first thing that was interesting was I remember seeing a video of Dylan Burns. I believe it was Dylan Burns. I could be 100% wrong, but I distinctly remember watching a Dylan Burns video on Israel-Palestine, and then someone posed the question to him if he supported BDS or not, and he point blank said, no, he does not support the BDS movement, and that he believed that it was inherently anti-Semitic. That could be wrong. I could be remembering the latter part wrong. I distinctly remember him saying that he didn't support the BDS movement. The second part is a bit fuzzy, but I do remember that. I was trying to find that clip, but I haven't found it, so I could be, again, completely wrong. Or the point that he could have been making is, oh, he believed that the BDS movement has some elements of anti-Semitism in it, so he can't officially sanction the entire movement as okay or bad. But another foreign policy decision that made him very much a interesting figure on the quote-unquote left was when he started publicly decrying the Afghanistan withdrawal. Now, he technically wasn't advocating for people to remain in Afghanistan, but him and Xanderhall were very much openly just being like, yeah, the Afghanistan withdrawal was a bad thing, and then a lot of people were decrying them for that, basically saying like, no, we should have been pulled out. We should be gone, which is a fact. I'm not here to really debate whether or not, like, the withdrawal could have been handled better or worse. That's not really here or there. I'm pretty sure you would be able to see clips or something of mine or Dylan's that would explain better the perspectives in regards to this. But I would generally say that it was just better that we pulled out of the situation altogether rather than remaining. Another example comes from red baiting. The biggest one to catch my attention was when he was doing McCarthyism with Comrade DeSantis. Basically, he made this video about, like, is DeSantis the Russians' pick for 2024? And then the video thumbnail is Comrade DeSantis. Basically doing the same thing that Resistance Libs did when they put the hammer and sickle over the O in GOP. Now, you might say, what? Well, you see, for those who don't know, which I guarantee you is very little, the term comrade is a term basically used exclusively for communists. Like, communists use that term to describe themselves. Like, come with us, comrade. It's commonly associated with the Soviet Union, and it's a term that is very much associated with communism and, to a degree, Russians in the West. But that's because the Soviet Union was what Russia was for a long period of time. So that's why the term is used for both of these groups. But people more than likely use the term comrade in regards to communism and red baiting. If you wanted to associate the Russian connection, he would have probably used the Russian version of the term comrade, tovarist, not the term that is used for explaining communism, like comrade. Now, I'm pretty sure some people would make the case that even if he used that term, it would be sort of red baiting, but I think that would be more good faith than, using the term comrade. And if you want one thing that further explains Dylan Burns' foreign policy, then look no further than the fact that Dylan Burns is a fan of the character Kyoshi from the Avatar franchise. If you are not a fan of Avatar, or if you've never even heard of Kyoshi, then you have literally no clue why that's relevant, but I assure you, it is literally the most relevant thing I can think of. Kyoshi is literally the most warmongering and pro-establishment avatars in the history of the franchise. And the piece of Avatar media that shows this in full is the canon webcomic Escape from the Spirit World, which is supposed to tie in the second and third seasons of the show, but this stuff is apparently expanded upon in the Kyoshi novels. So, if you don't know anything about Avatar, let's briefly explain the lore. This is a world where the four major elements, air, wind, earth, and fire, are bendable, where you can bend them. You can control rocks, you can control air, you can control fire, or you can control water, or you can control nothing and be a loser. But there's one person who is supposed to unite all of the people of the world and the spirit world. They are known as the Avatar. They have to bring balance and fight whatever enemies of the world need to be fought in that era. Each of the four elements have essentially divided themselves up into nations around the world. We have the air nomads, who are, as it states, nomadic monks who try to bring peace wherever they see fit. We have the water nation, which is divided into two tribes in the North and South Poles. We have the Earth Kingdom, a very corrupt, tyrannical kingdom, and the Fire Nation, an empire that secretly wants to expand their borders. And over the course of the franchise, you see how things change and develop for each of these four nations. But this comic explains that the Earth Kingdom, the objectively most corrupt monarchy in the Avatar mythos, after fighting a long-standing civil war, has quote-unquote fixed the problems of their nation thanks to Avatar Kyoshi. But the lower classes in the Earth Kingdom are tired of the Earth King because the war has shown that he is literally not even that good at what he can do. So they're like, we're sick and tired of the Earth King. And the lower classes start to rise up against the higher classes. And the Earth Kingdom, here is how bad the Earth Kingdom is in regards to its class struggle. You see, in the Earth Kingdom's main capital, Ba Sing Se, they literally divide the city into 3 rings. The mid-ring, which is where the king lives and all of the rich, advisors of the king. Then, at the 3rd ring, that's where all the poor people live. They have a extremely rigid caste system within their own nation. And the lower rings start rising up against the mid-rings. So, the king goes to Avatar Kyoshi and says, hey, can you, kill the protesters for me? But she refuses, only in the sense that she wants to maintain order, even stating that she opposes the revolution. She then offers the people within the nation a compromise. He turns the monarchy into a constitutional monarchy, and she gives him an elite group of earthbenders who are completely loyal to him and will control the city with rocky fists. known as the Dai Li. And, slight spoilers for Avatar, the Dai Li end up becoming one of the most corrupt. They are essentially the CIA, NSA, and the intelligence agencies of the Earth Kingdom. They essentially become the Earth Kingdom deep state, even at the point where the leader of the Dai Li ends up becoming the real leader of the Earth Kingdom, while the king remains a figurehead. Wait, I just realized, this is the compromise position, right? Where's the compromise? Kyoshi literally just gave the tyrannical king everything and the peasants nothing. In fact, everything that she did, thanks to the Civil War and everything she did to try and fix the Earth Kingdom, the Dai Li would then immediately just get rid of. And seeing this really made me go like, of course Dylan likes Kyoshi. Of course Dylan likes the fucking CIA avatar. Like, the avatar literally makes the CIA. Of course he likes that avatar. Because Dylan, for a long time, Dylan's been accused of being a CIA asset or parroting CIA talking points or, wokely spreading imperialism. But it's to be fair, is that really that far off? I don't think he's an asset. I don't think he's, I know, he and Vosh always... I'll get to that part in a second, but he definitely toes a lot of the lines in regards to, the Western media in the sense of how they push foreign policy, for better and for worse. And one element that showed that he definitely will toe the line even when it's you really probably shouldn't, came from the controversy surrounding the Dalai Lama. For those who don't remember the Dalai Lama controversy, the Dalai Lama essentially made out with a boy on a national stage, giving him a peck on the lips and then asking him, suck my tongue. And it's that's a bit weird. That everybody was making jokes about oh, haha, that's funny. The Dalai Lama's a pedophile. But then he's then Dylan Burns basically went around actually, this is actually a tradition very prominently in the Tibetan culture. It is very common for people in Tibet to stick their tongues out at each other, and it's also very common for them to give kisses on the mouth. Very, very common. Very, very interesting. Very common. It's a very widely held tradition. He always tried to add the caveat, oh, well, technically, it's weird that these things don't normally, happen, at the same time. That's weird. But, it is technically tradition that this happens, and it's and he made this video where it's I would find it very weird if this very prominent figure just openly decided to admit their pedophilic urges in front of a massive audience where cameras are watching them. It's dude, literally none of the stuff you're saying even remotely exonerates what happened. For starters, I'll just say this. He was very confused with the idea that a very prominent religious figure would molest a little boy. And it's is that really that uncommon, Dylan? That's not that uncommon. But secondly, him trying to back this up, oh, it's just a tradition. It's I don't care if this is a tradition. It's wrong. And call me offensive. Say oh, you just don't understand other people's cultures. I don't care. I do not care if it is tradition for their culture if it's wrong. And I said this when this story broke out, and I was going to use this example for this. Dylan, if you're watching this or reacting to this, I genuinely want to ask, do you support the Mezitza B'Peh? For those who don't know what the Mezitza B'Peh is, it is a tradition in radical Jewish sects where after the circumcision, the rabbi wraps their lips around the baby and then sucks the blood out and then spits it out. Do you support that, Dylan? Is that no, it's tradition. It's tradition. You can't call that out because it's tradition. Or are you only going to do that when the specific person you have to defend represents your own geopolitical interests? With this, I mentioned the freaking Noam Chomsky story about Jeffrey Epstein. Are you going to say, oh, no. No. You can't make jokes about Jeffrey Epstein and Noam Chomsky being together. You can't make those jokes. You can't make those references. You can't call out the weirdness of that. Or are you okay with that because Noam Chomsky doesn't reflect your geopolitical interests? but the Dalai Lama does. It's especially weird because Dylan's okay with calling out people that he's close to for reasons that are both good and not. Like, remember that mayoral person that I said that he worked on? Yeah, well, it turns out that person got involved in a lot of other shenanigans behind the scenes, and Dylan Burns called them out. Dylan Burns even called out a fellow streamer named Prime Case for reasons that would turn out to be completely made up. But it seems that one of the biggest things that probably is a huge divide in regards to Dylan Burns fans is the fact that Dylan Burns, ever since the war in Ukraine started, has basically fully transitioned into being, like, he's been this way for a bit, as I mentioned before, with like the Afghanistan stuff and Dalai Lama and other things, but it's like he's definitely towed sort of the mainstream analysis in regards to foreign intervention, at least mainstream for Democrat side of things. But one of the big things that he's been spearheading is this new trend of leftists that are absolutely brain dead, known as the Lockheed leftists, also known as anarcho-NATOists. Basically, they are leftists, or people who claim to be leftists, that support NATO and the military-industrial complex as jokes. And I've heard this said many times, like, it's just jokes. It's just jokes. It's just jokes. We're just joking around. But then, when people actually begin to criticize NATO, or people/groups that align with NATO's geopolitical interests, all of a sudden, tanky, you're tanky. And now all of a sudden, support for NATO is regarded as a litmus test on the left. We'll have Vosh, ironically, state that NATO is the thing that protects the left in the worldview of the modern day. Now, it's odd considering Dylan himself has stated that he only supports NATO in the time being, but ideally he wants it to be gone. But the problem is, the time being, he doesn't seem to go like, oh, I'm just supporting NATO, like, for the time being. The time being, he becomes NATO's biggest simp, becoming basically the biggest cheerleader for a cause without actually directly being involved in the cause. Like, it's not even like a freaking, what's the name of that battalion that the communists sent to Spain during the Civil War? It's not even like the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, where it's like they're actually going and supporting and fighting this specific group of people. But it's like, I'll give Dylan like some slight credit over other people. Like, unlike freaking Kevin Castley, who Dylan platformed very relentlessly, unlike him, who probably cheerleads from, like, he cheerleads 100% comfortably from the seat of his own home, Dylan is not in the seat comfortably in his own home. But I just find it very weird. Like this is one of the weirdest things that I've seen. Like, where it's kind of one of these big things that we see with people nowadays, where it's like, we especially nowadays see people who are so removed from the past left-wing movements that in actuality, they espouse things that the left-wing movements of the past would never really even align with. The two biggest examples that I've seen were nuclear energy, for one. All of a sudden, we have people who are on the left who claim to be on the left. Like, that's another thing we should say, like, on the left / claim to be on the left, who very much unironically 100% now support nuclear energy, when it's like the left has historically been anti-nuclear energy for very right reasons. But now all of a sudden we have this new breed of leftists that all of a sudden is like, no, anybody who is anti-nuclear energy is stupid, and that you need to support nuclear energy 100%. The second one, of course, being, now all of a sudden we have these people who are on the left, quote unquote, who unironically support NATO and say that NATO and support for NATO is now considered a litmus test. This movement is usually spearheaded by people who claim to be social democrats, but even, it's weird, like, even some social democrats, quote unquote, like, don't necessarily express, like, for example, Kyle Kalinske and Dylan Burns both identify as social democrats. Yet I think Kyle Kalinske, he seems to come from the quote-unquote perspective of an old-school social democrat that I guess has more ties to the socialist movement than you would think, which is weird considering he explicitly identifies as a capitalist to an extent. Meanwhile, Dylan Burns, he comes at social democracy seemingly from the perspective of the modern-day social democrat, and one of the biggest things that seems to identify modern-day social democracy is this long-standing idea of that in order to make your life better, the social democrats basically send all of the exploitation and all of the war and all of the problems somewhere else. One of the biggest things that people say about social democrats is that social democracy is usually built on the back of imperialism in another area. And again, this is seemingly from a position that they take ironically, which I don't think it's ironic. It really does not stem to be ironic. In fact, there is a iDubbbz thing that very much greatly explains irony. Look up iDubbbz irony, and you'll see the full clip in question, but I'll try my best to summarize it. Very interesting that I mentioned iDubbbz, because iDubbbz recently got into a controversy surrounding him renouncing some old views that he had on his videos. But anyways, the point here is he believes that irony exists on a circle. First, we have, like, sincerity, your sincere idea and position. Next, you have irony, which in a rhetoric sense means that you say something but you don't mean it. Essentially sarcasm. Then next, you have post-irony. Essentially, you use irony to express irony. Basically, your sincere position is one thing, then you have the ironic opinion, then you have post-irony, which is acting as if the ironic opinion is your real opinion. This would normally be where the irony circle ends, but then we have meta-irony, which for the sake of this, imagine it to be right smack dab on top of sincerity. The reason being is that meta-irony is where you are using irony to express your actual opinion on a subject. You word your actual opinion as if you are saying it ironically. It's intentionally done this way in order to confuse people. That is essentially what the Lockheed leftists are doing in regards to their viewpoints on things like Lockheed leftism or NATO. They word actual sincere support for NATO as if it's a joke, perhaps intentionally hyping up their position. Like they act as if they are the biggest NATO simps in the world. That way you can look at them and go, they're very clearly joking about their position, but in reality, they still support NATO, and their position is not really that far off from what they're actually saying. They're just saying it in this super hyper-focused way, and if you call them out on this, they shrug it off as, oh, I'm just joking, dude. Now, if this specific way of wording an opinion as if it's a joke, and having people look at it as if it's a joke, but also having enough sincerity in it that it actually can come off as like their actual serious position sounds familiar, that's because this is the exact same playbook that the alt-right used in its build-up to power. In fact, the video in which iDubbbz explains the irony circle was him literally going after a prominent alt-right creator known as Sam Hyde. Now, this is one thing that I'm going to say that is very controversial, but in fact, I don't necessarily believe that supporting or opposing NATO is necessarily a position that is a litmus test for leftists, depending on the ifs, ands, or buts. If you are, say, supporting the bad parts of NATO and very much wrongly praising like things that NATO should not be doing, like unilateral bombings and stuff, then that is definitely bad. But if you're supporting NATO in the sense of, in the meantime, we cannot trust Russia to do certain things, so in the meantime, we should just not try to push away from supporting NATO, but ideally you want NATO gone, then that is also a fair point. But I will say, if anybody wants to make support for NATO a litmus test for the left, then I have really bad news for you. If that is the litmus test you want to make, then the litmus test should be opposing NATO is the left-wing position. Let's just take a look. Delinque, La France Insoumise, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, Jeremy Corbyn, DSA, Evo Morales, Hugo Chavez, Lula, Noam Chomsky. The left has very much historically opposed NATO. So if your position is support for NATO is a litmus test for the left, then I got bad news for you. Now, again, I don't necessarily believe that support for NATO should be a litmus test because we're not at the point, especially in the United States, where we can have an actual discussion about NATO membership. A lot of these other nations, they can have discussions on NATO membership. And I will say this, if Russia really wanted NATO gone, then what they really should have done is just waited a couple of years because anti-NATO sentiment was steadily rising amongst the right and the left. Eventually, no matter which parties were in charge, they would have probably advocated for the abolition of NATO, and then Putin would have been able to do whatever the heck he wanted. Invading Ukraine was literally the dumbest thing he could have done in regards to, freaking NATO. If he wanted NATO gone, then invading Ukraine was literally the dumbest thing he could have done. Invading Ukraine literally changed an entire country's election based on their stance on Putin, NATO, or whatever. The French election, the four frontrunners had to completely change their stances in regards to NATO. In the UK, the only party that explicitly stated that they were against NATO membership changed their tune in their most recent convention due to the fact that this kind of changed things. The far left party in a certain nation that was very, very prominent in regards to its NATO negotiations had to officially change their stance from explicitly anti-NATO to agnostically pro-NATO. See, this is why I don't think of it as a litmus test. It's like a mixed bag. It doesn't really make that much difference. Ideally, Dylan Brits would probably see the position that I have and go, okay, well, yeah, I guess I technically agree with that, because technically my position is no different than his. Ideally, I want NATO gone. Ideally, but I also understand we're not at the point where we can abolish NATO or even have the discussion on whether or not we can slowly start removing ourselves from NATO. But I also don't then turn around and go, NATO is objectively good and promotes leftism around the world, even though it never has. And while I'm here, I guess I should say a lot of these other positions in regards to certain things so that Dylan Burns cannot take this out of context, even though he 100% will. Fuck Putin. Fuck Zelensky less than Putin. I am objectively a radical pacifist in regards to foreign policy, and I think that's really the only actual moral stance you can take, really, for the most part. In any peace deal with Russia, withdrawal of Russian troops is the first priority that should be done. Svoboda and Azov are not as prevalent in the Ukrainian government and military as they are made up to be. Ukraine does have an anti-Semitism problem, but it is not as pronounced as many people like to say it is. NATO expansion technically did play a role in the invasion of Ukraine, but not the role that a lot of the quote-unquote tankies would want you to believe. Do I believe that Putin invaded purely because he wanted to stop NATO expansion and that they were encroaching on his borders and blah, blah, blah? Tankies would say that that is the reason why, and that is justified as to why he did it. I say that the role that played was scapegoat. Even if you wanted to play devil's advocate and then say, oh, both sides are to blame, that's literally the closest thing you can even get to blaming people who are not Russian. Russia serves the biggest, primest blame for what they're doing in Ukraine right now. I personally don't believe that we should be sending military aid in regards to that kind of stuff in Ukraine. If I were a member of Senate or Congress, then I'd probably vote present on basically any Ukraine package. If it were 100% something that was not weapons, mostly medical stuff, then I'd be 100% okay with that. I also believe Ukrainian refugees should be welcome to come to the United States however they see fit. I don't deny Ukraine the right to fight until the last Ukrainian. If they want to, by all means. But also people should be free to leave if they want. I don't think that's a thing that Zelensky's saying you can't do. But I'm just saying, I believe people in Ukraine and Russia should have the right to speak out against the war. And I try my best to denounce misinformation from both sides of the aisle on this issue. Granted, we all know that there's one side that is spreading a bit more misinformation than the other. I mean, I think we all know what it is, but I guess I'll say it for the sake of saying it. The tanky side is the one that spreads the more misinformation in regards to the war in Ukraine, touting basically every single pro-Russian talking point in regards to the war. While the pro-Ukrainian side, sometimes they do kind of stretch the truth a little bit. Example, downplaying Ukrainian far-right sentiment too much. Like the tankies like to pretend that it is everywhere in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the pro-Ukrainian side likes to pretend it's not a thing at all. Another one is the NAFO thing. Now, let me explain what NAFO is for those of you who don't know. NAFO, also known as the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, is a parody of NATO and NATO supporters that basically use Doge memes to express their support for Ukraine against Russia. They became pretty prominent online, and a lot of the pro-Russia people, the tankies, very much, I was going to say they very much imply, but they don't imply. They basically state that NAFO is I guess they believe it's this CIA-run op. But wait, I stated that this is something to be against the NAFO side or against the pro-Ukrainian side. Well, let's be real. Here's what I'm going to say. This is very common for movements, where movements online will be used by people and organizations in power to spread certain goals. NAFO could very much be, and probably very much is, an organization, or not even an organization, but a meme or thing that very much sprouted naturally. That's very common for things to do online, where people will sprout things naturally. But given the fact that it is a very politicized thing, and it very much represents certain people's geopolitical interests, I wouldn't be surprised if certain accounts of NAFO were propped up in algorithms or propped up in regards to certain things. But this is nothing new. Russia did the same thing for certain people spreading their geopolitical interests, and so too does Mexico, so too does the Americas, so too does Africa, so too does India, so too does England. So they all spread certain things on social media to get their political interests in mind, and it can be a natural thing. And another example, the Tea Party. The Tea Party, I 100% say, was a natural thing that happened, but it just so happened that people in power then harnessed that energy into something that could be translated into political action for their own political goals. I'm not even saying this to shit on NAFO. I don't really care. The one thing I should shit on them for is one other thing, because there is one other thing that I've seen in regards to how Dylan and other people in the pro-Ukrainian side do in regards to Ukraine that is this huge, big piece of misinformation that I genuinely am this is just such a blatantly wrong piece of information that I am genuinely mad that this has somehow remained prevalent in the discourse, but has never been called out up to this point. Because I haven't seen anybody bring this up, apparently. One big point of contention is always their problems with Hassan, because Hassan will say things that do not reflect their geopolitical interests in regards to this war, both rightfully and wrongfully. And one of the big things that Dylan or one of the other NAFO people or whatever will say is, imagine how a Ukrainian leftist must feel seeing Hassan, this big left-wing streamer, express quote-unquote pro-Russian sentiment in regards to this conflict. For starters, I don't necessarily believe that Hassan says things that are pro-Russian. Like, I mean, I could be wrong. I don't really look into Hassan that much. I do remember he did that thing where he, like, watched a Gravel Institute video that was reportedly wrong, but then he was, like, agreeing with them. But that thing about what the pro-NATO people say, and Dylan especially, just gets me so mad because it's just like, what do you mean? Like, legitimately, what do you mean? The leftists in Ukraine are pro-Russia. Like, all of the left-wing parties in freaking Ukraine are pro-Russia. The Party of Christian Socialists, the Communist Party of Ukraine, the Socialist Party of Ukraine, Держава, Union of Left Forces, Political Party Socialists, Left Opposition, Nashi, Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine. Granted, those last two are Nazbol, but to be fair, that is sadly what a lot of Eastern Bloc countries consider left-wing. I mean, you should see the freaking far-left parties in Russia. Like, literally, the Communist Party of Russia had Dugin as a supervisor during its foundation or during its reformation. I mean, a lot, if not all those parties are banned because of their pro-Russian ties. I have not seen a single left-wing party in Ukraine that was anti-Russia. So I genuinely don't know what he means by Ukrainian leftists must be so mad at Hassan, because I think a lot of the actual left in Ukraine would support what Hassan is saying. But in actuality, here's what he really means. What he really means is liberals in Ukraine. He doesn't mean leftists, he means liberals. But he thinks that the terms are interchangeable. Like, there's one person that I brought on that was like, look, see, I guess this was supposed to be his example of what he meant by leftists in Ukraine. But this person in question said, like, they loved watching Destiny, and it's like, not a leftist. There goes. Problem solved. They're not leftists. The end. The most we get is something vague, like, oh, he knows some communists in Ukraine that don't like what Hassan says or whatever. And it's like, can we see them? I'm pretty sure he might go like, I mean, yeah, I interviewed some of them in this episode here and here. And it's like, okay, great. If that's true, then by all means. I guess proven wrong. I mean, I'm not saying that there can't be people within those parties that probably, in retrospect, are like, hold on, actually getting the Russian tanks to come in are actually kind of making me go, I don't like this no more. But my biggest problem with Dylan in regards to the Ukraine war, and that's where I'm going to have to end it off, is very simple. I don't see a plan, and that's kind of one of the biggest problems and why I'm truly am like a bit of a radical pacifist. It's like every single foreign policy decision, there's always enter, but never exit. There's never an exit plan. Like, even if Dylan was saying, like, I have an idea for an exit plan, but he doesn't want to say it because if he says it, then that would give Russia some ideas, that'd be one thing. But I legitimately looked in a lot of his Ukraine videos, and I couldn't find anything that even remotely said, like, here is the plan to get out of Ukraine if things push come to shove. And that's because Dylan said it in his video where he's like, basically, he does say, like, fight to the last Ukrainian. And I'm not saying that as to, because I'm pretty sure, I think I heard him or someone else make that statement, like, oh, saying that statement inherently implies, like, oh, Ukraine's gonna fall. But it's like, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it could be, like, fight to the last Ukrainian or fight to the last Russian, where that's, like, your only end goal in mind. Like, there should be some sort of plan or actual thing. We've went into foreign policy endeavors without having a game plan, and you know what happened? We got Vietnam and we got Iraq. And pretty sure a bunch of the other wars can be identified as such. But I'm pretty sure a lot of people want to identify this one with Iraq and Vietnam because those were the big wars that everybody got involved in. It's kind of why people are taking this situation because they're comparing it to the US's biggest three foreign policy endeavors: World War II, Vietnam, and Iraq. Both sides want to do a comparison to one of those wars. Dylan, and of course a lot of other people, see this as the next World War II. Hopefully not in the way that ends in nuclear catastrophe. But the other side, like the tankies, of course, see this as the Vietnam or the Iraq, because those are the wars that got a bunch of people in the streets protesting against the military-industrial complex. And now they see it as that. But the Ukrainian war is not necessarily either of those, especially if we don't let it be any of those. But anyways, that's basically where I'm going to have to wrap it up there. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to find a future video mine comes out. And if you want some more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.